Sure, I guess I can start.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brandon Karcher. So, my background sort of began teaching in communication studies at Purdue University, and then I transitioned into sort of the educational technologist role. And from there, I came to Bucknell, and my work as the manager of instructional technology is a little bit probably wider encompassing than a traditional instructional technologist would do, simply because of the size of our institution. So I do a lot of work with helping with instructional design, working with technology, setting expectations, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today, and just kind of supporting faculty in their instructional design needs.
Thanks, Brandon. Doug?
So I hope everyone can hear me here, but at the moment I don't seem to have any audio, but I'm just going to follow the program and then I'm going to just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Doug Wilson and I'm an instructional designer in Dallas College, which is in Dallas, Texas. We have about 90 to 100,000 students on 7 campuses. And I hold a doctorate in learning design and technology from Penn State. I've been an instructional designer for about 6 years now, and also a faculty member at a local university, Texas A&M University Commerce. And that's just a little bit about me. So right now, my main job is to work with faculty to move their face-to-face courses in the COVID pandemic online. And so there's no shortage of work there. And that's a bit about me.
Thank you, Doug. Hopefully we'll get your audio issues worked out. We can hear you, just so you're aware. So let me start with just a basic question to get us started, and I'm going to turn to the audience questions in just a minute. I wonder just, on the broad topic that we have for this half hour, designing online classes, do each of you have a key takeaway that you'd like to be sure the audience walks away with at the end of this 30 minutes?
So I think one of the key takeaways, and I kind of hinted on this a little bit. I think one of the takeaways that I hope people come away with after a session like this is to try to manage your expectations of, and I don't say that in sort of a negative term. I don't mean that as, manage your expectations because you can only do so many things. But I think that's more of a focus on the things that getting the questions answered that you need, focusing on the things that you can do and do them really well, and keeping your students first, making sure that the things that you're doing and the decisions you're making in designing your courses are keeping students first in your mind. And so I hope that's some of the answers and the help that we're able to give today will point us in that direction and help you make those types of decisions.
Thanks, Brandon. Doug, do you have a follow-up to that?
I don't think I could have said it better than was just said. I think there's sometimes a focus on the technology and the bright, shiny object in the room, and that sometimes get in the way of focusing on the student. And so when the Association for Educational Communications and Technology talks about centering the student in the experience, whatever tool you're going to use, whatever the discipline or the knowledge domain, it can get kind of confusing. To bring it all back to where it needs to be, just remember that individual student in your course who's going to be out there somewhere on the internet, and gear your practice, what you're trying to do online, toward that individual student. If you do that, that's going to have a multiplier effect, and other students will be able to benefit from that singular approach. Just keep that individual in mind.
That's great, Doug. Thank you. So let me give you a question from the audience, and a few people have posed some variation on this. What are some top ways, some best strategies to encourage student engagement in online learning and online classes?
So I'd like to jump in there on this one because student engagement, certainly in a community college, is important, since we don't have as many completers or degree earners in the community college. And so we also know from the research that students' attention span is limited. So the literature indicates that you have to grab their attention straight away. If you want to read about that, getting students' attention, Gagne is in the literature. But that's one of the first things, a prime directive of sorts, to grab their attention. And one of the best ways to do that is a discussion forum. They've been around for a while, but they're sort of a go-to utility. And the idea of a discussion forum in an online community or an online class is that you build relationships, as I think has been mentioned, but also it's the quality of the relationships, right? Before learning can happen, people need to know each other and trust each other and be comfortable with each other. So it's the faculty member's job to build that trust. And so a discussion forum, an introduction, people post pictures of themselves with dogs or their family members. They get to know each other like that. And then on that foundation, you can build and move forward. So a simple discussion forum is one of the key ways that I recommend faculty use to build engagement. And then good things can spring from there. It's a little more complicated than that, but I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you. Brandon, do you have something you want to add to that one?
Yeah, no, that was great. I think one of the key points that I generally try to push and kind of maybe not prod, but kind of push to faculty is, it was when they say, how do I get my students to be engaged? I want to know what they mean by that, because that means something different to different people. For some of our faculty, that means I want them to do the readings and be prepared in class. For some of them, that means I want them to post on something like a discussion forum. So I think the context matters there. But one of the things that I usually try to do to kind of to push engagement with students is to kind of, and Doug alluded to this, creating community with your students. And my personal style with that is to have fun with it. So I have very much enjoyed doing sort of quick, small video assignments. And, whether that's done using your institutional repository, if you have one of those, or you have something like Kaltura or something like that to record videos, or even if you're using something like Flipgrid to find fun, new ways, unique ways that your students are able to engage with each other and have a little fun with it.
Great, thank you. A few people are asking about accessibility, so I'm going to group those together into one question. How do you suggest instructors follow best practices, both around online design, but specifically around accessibility practices? Many instructors are feeling overwhelmed by this transition to online teaching, and I think they want to be sure that they're designing and teaching in a way that is as accessible as possible.
So there are a couple of ways. Why don't you go ahead and take that one?
I was about to say the same thing, Brandon. But sure, I'll take it. Yeah. So this one's difficult, and I understand that instructors at different institutions will have varying levels of support when it comes to creating accessible materials. So whenever I work with someone who is trying to create course content and they want to try to make it as accessible as possible, a lot of times it's as simple as showing them how to use descriptive links and use headings and understand how some of these basics work. There are a variety of great resources out there. I know my former institution at Purdue, they have some really good resources on creating accessible Word documents and PDFs. So a lot of times where I start with someone is sort of at the basics level to get them to understand how these components work and why they're important, and how designing in a way and how things like universal design is good for everyone. And so that's generally where I start. If you have the ability to do things like captions and things like that with your videos, sometimes your institutions will have some support and funding for you to be able to do that. If you're making videos, that's also a great place to start.
Brandon, you're spot on with your answer, and the accessibility component has only grown in importance with so much coursework and educational materials being moved online. And frankly, it's a labor of love, might be one way to describe it, because working on the accessibility issues is not necessarily a subject matter. It's not necessarily something a subject matter expert would have studied in school. And so it starts with a simple thing, maybe Microsoft Office tools, PowerPoint, Word. Most of these tools that pretty much all of us in higher education use in secondary schools have robust systems of accessibility. And with the push of a button, you can begin to make a Word document or a PowerPoint accessible. I think one of the benefits of working with someone like Brandon, or working with someone like me or Jonathan, anyone who's participating on this panel, is universal design is the way to go when we think about creating accessible documents or course materials for all students. And essentially what it means is that if you privilege those students who may have learning disabilities, or those who are sight impaired or hearing impaired, and you design for them on the front end, then that's going to benefit everyone else who perhaps is not impaired in any way. And there's no one right path toward accessibility, but I do believe that it begins on the front end with design and having a conversation with someone like Brendan or John or your faculty members participating in this panel, and having a conversation about that while you're working on it.
That's really helpful, Doug. And I want to just add to that and emphasize for people on this call who are not connected to or familiar with the faculty developers, instructional designers, instructional technologists who work at their institutions, there are really significant resources there available to you, sometimes at the level of your specific college or university, some at a regional or district level, depending on what your setup is. So, we'd encourage you to connect with those colleagues to the extent they're available to you. We've had a few questions that come from folks who are concerned about labs or hands-on classes. How do you transition the needs that you have as an instructor and how you're designing the class, and then the needs of your students around learning in a lab environment or a hands-on, practical or clinical environment? Brandon, do you want to start that one?
Sure. So we have a varying sort of we have a range of what a lot of our faculty are doing, and I think that they will tell you that no matter which direction you go to run your labs or to transition your labs to this online or hybrid format, it's tricky, and it depends on what type of lab you're doing and what you're trying to demonstrate. So we have faculty doing everything from setting up GoPros and taking GoPros with them to the lab to actually do some demonstrations and show students how to do these things. And they're scheduling times at which the students can come into the lab later. So they do sort of get that video demonstration of how to do it. And then there's a schedule around when they can come in and access the content. Now, whether or not that will actually be possible come the fall semester here in about 5 weeks, I'm not sure. But we're also doing things like transitioning to virtual labs. And there are even companies out there that will help you design labs that can be run in virtual reality so that you could have your own virtual lab as well. So there are a wide range. But I think this goes back to, when you're thinking about, okay, I have this lab class, how do I get this online or at least in a hybrid environment? I think the first thing you have to ask is, what am I trying to get my students to learn in this lab? And is it feasible to do those things online? And if it's just not, you may have to rethink how you're going to teach these students these things. So I think this kind of goes back to expectation setting and figuring out what you can and what you can't do. Like those things are really important to think about when you're considering some labs that are online.
Thanks, Brandon. Doug?
Brandon, yes. Thanks, John. Brandon, you again touched on some key pieces. And so on some levels, there's quite a bit of putting the cart before the horse sometimes when working with faculty. And I know that's a time-worn cliche, but when Brandon talks about knowing what it is you want to do before you go in to teach the lab, I think another way that I would say that to faculty is, what are the learning outcomes? Are there course level outcomes? Are there module level outcomes? And so in a biology course, for example, where you may have 10 chapters to get through in a freshman biology class, maybe before in a face-to-face environment, you could just say, read all the chapters, and then we're going to meet in the lab, on Wednesdays or whatever it is. And in the current environment, it might not be possible to do that. And so some of the front end work that will need to be done is, what exactly is the course description, and what does it require me to teach, and what can maybe I, sort of back burner, and then write those outcomes. At the end of this module on mitosis, students will be able to draw a diagram of cell division, or they'll shoot a video on it. And so, again, this is a conceptual piece that I'm going to describe right now, but in inquiry-based learning modules, where we talk oftentimes about project-based learning or problem-based learning, much of what happens and what students produce, right, we want to make their learning visible. A lot of what they do, you can put it on them to come up with how they're going to describe mitosis, and give them some options to do that, and how they're going to demonstrate their knowledge about that particular process. And so how does that work? You give them some limited resources. You give them some questions, maybe large or small, or maybe pressing issues in biology, to take this example, some of the bigger questions in the real world, and you apply that to your lab, and then you kind of set students loose to go solve that problem for you as a framework. That's probably not the same as a traditional lab, but why can't a student go on an internet search to find out what biologists are doing in labs, and maybe try to recreate that? There's a thing that I've worked on before, that I've done. We call them low fidelity simulations. So you can require students, and this requires a rethink of the learning outcomes, to actually make something, a prototype, and take a picture of it and send it in. You can use things like Jamboard. And so Jamboard is a collaborative software in the Google toolkit, where groups of students can get together and put Post-its up. They can draw things. So the representation of what they typically do in a lab might look a little bit different, but it achieves the same learning goal. So the faculty member, as a subject matter expert, given the constraints of pandemic and teaching online, is the one who primarily needs to sort through that in collaboration with the instructional designer and others, and devise a structure and a system that can produce the learning result, or the evidence of the learning that you want your students to show. But it might be a little bit different than what you're used to doing. So I hesitate to say think outside the box, and so I'm not going to say that. But again, it goes back to the original question. Your students can help you solve that riddle, and so put it on them to do some of that heavy lifting, and get comfortable with that.
And Doug, real quick, I wanted to just also follow up on something you touched on there. Is you talked about how rethinking kind of what they're doing and how they're doing it, but I also wanted to, it kind of probably made me remember that I've also heard some conversations about changing what the lab is, or rethinking what a lab is, rather than being a room on campus where you go and do experiments. That lab is now in a botany class at your backyard. The lab now is, can you find any local body of water, and what are some low or no cost experiments that students can do at home to achieve the same learning outcomes, or at least similar learning outcomes to what they had before. It's just that the lab is fundamentally different now, and they're on their own or at wherever they live.
Thank you. We've had a few questions about, from the point of view of faculty they're anticipating this fall needing to manage online and in-person students simultaneously. They're going to have some students on any given day of the class coming to meet in person, other students who are going to be continuing to meet online. So they're juggling that. They're juggling synchronous and asynchronous instruction. What suggestions do you have as they make that adjustment, which is even a new adjustment from the one they made this past spring?
This is kind of the question, I think, for this coming semester for a lot of people. And there's no way around that. This is logistically can be a nightmare. There are more things that you need to monitor and keep track of. And something as simple as, if you have students and you are in a face-to-face class with limited or half of your class or whatever it is, and you have others that are online, even simple things as monitoring the chat can be something that would be very easy to forget, or it's much easier to pay attention to the people that are sitting in front of you than it is for the people that are online. And so one of the things that I would recommend there is to help you manage some of these logistics. Just like I've done in the past in communication courses, I've had students run the camera because we record student speeches and then I give them feedback and give them a copy of their video. And this same idea, because I'm trying to grade and do other things at the same time, have your students help you to manage some of the logistics. If you have a student who can help you monitor the chat, or make sure that they, someone just to be sort of your part-time assistant in the classroom to help you do that. I think it can be one simple way to alleviate some of the in-class sort of logistics of making sure that you are addressing both the students that are virtual and the students that are also face-to-face.
Really nice thoughts there, Brandon. And I'll just add to it that my background in television news tells me that when I'm speaking with a faculty member, one of the fundamental things that makes the online environment different when you have face-to-face students and then you also have online students. I think that faculty and I personally want to be more granular, more intentional, perhaps even minute by minute, what is supposed to be happening and scheduling that out. In the online environment, those students who are at a distance, typically in the courses that I teach, because they're at a distance, I privilege them because they're not in front of me. And they're at a distance. And all of this technology, as you're witnessing during this webinar, it's actually a filter. So it takes a little bit of something out of the experience. And so one of the ways around that is to schedule. And I've done this. It might work for you. It might not. It might be worth a try. Scheduling an assignment or a class session minute by minute about what is supposed to be happening. And that's a little bit more than what I'm used to in face-to-face, when there's a lot more wiggle room. And so when you're making that calendar, or you're making that assignment for the class, maybe make it a little tighter, step by step. And I think the benefit of that is that students will know where they're supposed to be. You'll know where they're supposed to be. And then, as Brandon mentioned, if you kept that master student in your course, the sort of student that we all have who kind of gets it, whatever happens in the class, leverage those students and have them help support you and fill in some of the gaps for you in the course.
Thanks, Doug. We've also had several questions on the topic of assessment, how to create authentic assessments that make sense in an online environment, I think there were also some questions along the lines of wanting to make sure that there is the same sort of rigor and integrity to the assessments that faculty are using in an online course that would maybe need to be different from those that they used in a traditional face-to-face course. I realize that's a very big question, but do you have a few things that you'd each like to say on that topic?
I was going to let you take a stab at this one first.
Sure,
Doug.
I'll keep this really. Oh, okay. And I'll keep this really tight. One of the things working in the online environment I've been trying to do is be a lot more intentional about being focused and not letting my thoughts wander too much. So the short answer to that question, and this may sound superficial, is to allow students to have multiple opportunities to demonstrate what they know. Don't make everything an objective test. Don't make everything a written response, although I'm a big fan of written responses. Give them some small stakes, low stakes, we call them formative assessments, to test their knowledge, where if they don't do well, or they didn't do their homework, or they didn't do the reading because they're working or they're trying to take care of a sick parent with COVID who's in the hospital, right? That happens. Or a parent who's lost the job. Try to add multiple layers of assessment and evaluation, and try to make sure that they're mixed, right? A Major League Baseball pitcher doesn't win the pennant or the World Series throwing fastballs every inning for 9 innings. And there's the inevitable sports metaphor. If you let me talk too long, you'll get one of those. So mix it up. That's the point.
So I can't help, but it's very hard for me to sort of uncouple the discussion on authentic assessments from one that is many times in my experience tied to academic integrity, because you could use more authentic assessments as a way to kind of ensure more of an environment where students are. It makes it a little bit more difficult to cheat. And so, but where I come in from this is more of an area of empathy. So when I've been talking to faculty about assessments and how are they going to do assessments now, how am I going to give my insert 400 question multiple choice exam in a way that I can be sure that there's no way to cheat when all of my students are online. And at our institution, we don't have sort of a proctoring service. We don't pay for that. So really, the answer for them is you can't do this the same way you've always done it. And so when we're talking about sort of assessments, we're doing a lot of rethinking the way that you're doing your assessments by moving, as Jonathan talked about at the very beginning, to more authentic assessments. But sometimes it's as simple as understanding the environment in which you're going to be teaching in now and leveraging that in ways that you couldn't, and doing things that you couldn't when you were face to face. So, for example, we've been working with some of the language courses. I'm working with a professor right now who is teaching Latin, and we just discussed the idea, and we're talking about a problem yesterday of, how do I talk to my students? How do we practice Latin in class when we're not face to face anymore? And Zoom is kind of inefficient for what we're trying to do. I mean, I don't know how I'm going to give my exams, and they're very important to me, to this class. And you can't just learn Latin by reading some words. And so we discussed things as simple as, doing verbal examinations now. It's very difficult to fake a verbal examination in a class where it's based on speaking Latin. And so I think whenever we're thinking about these assessments, I think this once again goes back to setting expectations as to what do you want to test with your students' knowledge, and what are some ways that we can do that. Maybe it's authentic assessment, but maybe it's just kind of rethinking where you are and what kind of environment you're teaching in, and leveraging that to the best of your ability to get what you need from your students.
Thank you both. So we are just past the hour, which means it's time to shift on to our next topic. But I want to thank Brandon Karcher and Douglas Wilson, our first two experts for this Q&A session. Thank you both.